The letter from the Pinecrest Ridge HOA Architectural Committee was 4 paragraphs long, and it denied my shed permit on the grounds that a proposed 12 by 16-foot storage structure would, and I am quoting directly here, negatively impact the visual harmony of the community and exceed the allowable footprint for accessory structures in Section 12 of the Community Guidelines. 4 paragraphs to deny me a shed. A garden shed where I wanted to store my lawn equipment and tools, and the camping gear that had been living in my garage for 2 years, making it impossible to park both cars inside. I read that letter standing at my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I did something I almost never do. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, because the alternative was to stand in the street and scream, and I am 46 years old, and I have a reputation to maintain. My name is Thomas Garrett, and I live at 7 Ridgecrest Way in Pinecrest Ridge, a planned community outside of Louisville, Kentucky, where I have owned my home for 7 years and where I have had a complicated relationship with the HOA for approximately 6 years and 11 months. The first month was fine. Everything is fine the first month. You have not yet learned the specific texture of the particular bureaucratic nightmare you have moved into, and temporary ignorance feels a lot like peace. I am a structural engineer. I have been a structural engineer for 21 years. I design buildings for a living. Large buildings, complicated buildings, buildings that have to meet code requirements in multiple jurisdictions and satisfy engineers and inspectors and clients who all have different opinions about what the finished product should look like. I understand how structures work. I understand load-bearing calculations and soil composition and drainage and foundation design and every technical element that determines whether something you build will stand up for 10 years or 100. I am, in other words, exactly the kind of person you do not want to casually deny a permit to, because I will know immediately whether your stated reason is real. The shed permit denial was not real. The Section 12 provision they cited allowed accessory structures up to 200 square feet. My proposed shed was 192 square feet. I was 8 square feet under the limit. The visual harmony claim was not a defined standard anywhere in the community guidelines. It was an aesthetic opinion dressed up as a rule. I had submitted drawings, material specifications, a site plan showing the shed would be screened from the street by the house itself and surrounded by existing plantings on 3 sides. There was no legitimate basis for the denial. But I also knew what was behind it. The HOA Architectural Committee at Pinecrest Ridge had 3 members. The chair was a man named Russell Beaumont, who was 60 years old, who owned the largest lot on the ridge, and who had been on the committee for 8 years. Russell had a particular view about what Pinecrest Ridge should look like, and that view was essentially that it should look exactly like it looked when he had moved in, and that any change to any property that he could see or imagine seeing should require his approval, which he would grant when he felt like it and deny when he did not, and that his aesthetic preferences were standards and his standards were rules. The second member was a woman named Carol Nguyen, who had been on the committee for 3 years and who agreed with Russell about 90% of the time and spent the other 10% of the time not saying anything. The third member, theoretically, was supposed to be a resident elected to a 2-year term. That seat had been vacant for 14 months because Russell had twice found procedural reasons to invalidate the elections that had filled it. I had submitted a storage shed application because my garage was overflowing. I had been careful, thorough, and entirely within the stated rules. Russell had denied it anyway because Russell did not like sheds. He had said so at an HOA meeting 18 months earlier in a comment about how storage structures cluttered the community aesthetic. It was not a policy. It was a preference. But in Pinecrest Ridge, under Russell Beaumont's committee, preferences and policies had become indistinguishable. I read the denial letter a second time. Then I went inside, made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started thinking. Now I want to be honest with you about where my head was when I started thinking. I was not immediately thinking about revenge or about making a point or about any of the escalation that eventually happened. I was thinking practically the way engineers think. I needed storage space. I had a right to storage space on my own property within the rules. I had been denied despite being within the rules. What were my options? Option 1 was to appeal the denial through the HOA's internal process. I had looked at that process. It involved submitting a written appeal to the full HOA board, which then had 60 days to review it, and the board's decision was final except through litigation. The full HOA board was 5 people, 3 of whom Russell had various social connections to, and none of whom had ever overturned a committee decision in the 2 years I had been tracking meeting minutes. Option 2 was litigation. I could sue the HOA for denying a permit on pretextual grounds. I had a reasonable case. I also had a job, a family, and limited appetite for spending 2 years in discovery over a garden shed. Option 3 was to find something else I could build that was within my rights and that Russell Beaumont could not touch. I am a structural engineer. I spent approximately 4 hours over 2 evenings going through the Pinecrest Ridge Community Guidelines, the Kentucky State Statutes for Homeowners Associations, the Louisville Metro Zoning Ordinances for residential properties, and the building code provisions that applied to my lot. And I found something. The Pinecrest Ridge Community Guidelines, like most HOA documents written by people who were focused on what they wanted to control rather than what they might have forgotten to address, had a significant omission. The guidelines covered structures in exhaustive detail: fences, sheds, decks, pergolas, pools, driveways, additions. They had height limits, footprint limits, setback requirements, material specifications. Russell had been very thorough in what he had written into the restrictions. But the guidelines said nothing about underground structures. Not one word, no provision, no restriction, no mention. The word underground did not appear in the document. The word subterranean did not appear. Basement was referenced only in the context of additions to the main dwelling. Excavation was not mentioned at all. I sat with this for a moment, and then I read the Kentucky State Residential Building Code section on underground structures. Then I read the Louisville Metro zoning provisions. Then I called a colleague of mine, a geotechnical engineer named Phil Dorsey, who I had worked with on several commercial projects and who had experience with below-grade construction in the Louisville area soil conditions. I explained the situation to Phil, not the HOA drama part, just the technical question: my lot, my soil type, the water table in my area, the feasibility of a below-grade structure of significant size. Phil asked me a few questions, pulled up the soil survey data for my neighborhood, and gave me his preliminary assessment. It was feasible, not simple, not cheap, but feasible. The soil conditions in my area were good for below-grade construction. The water table was manageable with proper waterproofing. He would need to do a formal geotechnical report to give me real numbers. "How big are you thinking?" Phil asked. I had been thinking about this since I found the omission in the guidelines. I was not going to build something small. If I was doing this, if I was making this point, I was going to make it in a way that could not be overlooked or diminished. 2,000 square feet, I said. Phil was quiet for a moment. That's a serious project. I know, I said. We are talking full excavation, engineered foundation system, waterproofing membrane, mechanical ventilation, electrical, drainage. You're looking at significant cost. I know, I said again. Why underground specifically? HOA denied my shed permit, I said. Another pause. How big was the shed? 12 by 16. Phil laughed, the laugh of an engineer who immediately understands the geometry of the situation. Okay, he said, I'm in. Let me do the geotech report. My wife, Sandra, had a somewhat more complicated reaction when I explained the plan to her that evening. Sandra is a tax attorney, which means she has a high tolerance for complexity and a very specific kind of patience that comes from spending her career in a profession where the rules are Byzantine but ultimately decipherable if you are willing to do the work. She listened to my explanation, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said, "How much is this going to cost?" I gave her the preliminary number. It was not a small number. She looked at me for a long moment, and there is genuinely no rule against it. Not one word, I said. And you've read the whole document 3 times. She picked up her wine glass and took a thoughtful sip. What are you going to put in it? This was the question I had been enjoying thinking about. Because the thing about a 2,000 square foot underground space is that it is a genuinely useful thing to have if you are willing to think creatively about what to do with it. I had been describing it to Phil as a bunker because that was the most vivid description of a large below-grade structure, and because I had started doing research into what serious below-grade residential spaces actually contained, and the answer was, whatever you want, because you have 2,000 square feet and no aesthetic committee telling you what to put in it. I told Sandra what I was thinking. She listened. By the end, she was the one with the legal pad making notes. We spent 3 weekends doing detailed planning. I did the structural design myself. With Phil's geotechnical report as the foundation, I was fully qualified to engineer the structure, and doing it myself saved a significant amount on design fees. Sandra researched the permit requirements, of which there were several and all of which we were going to meet completely and correctly, because the entire point of this project was that it would be unassailable. Phil reviewed my calculations. I brought in a mechanical engineer I knew named Derek to design the ventilation system, because below-grade ventilation is specific enough that I wanted a specialist. The permit application we submitted to Louisville Metro was 47 pages long. It included full structural drawings, geotechnical report, drainage plan, mechanical ventilation design, waterproofing specifications, and a detailed construction sequence. I had the permit approved in 6 weeks, which is honestly faster than some above-grade permits I have pulled. The city building department had no objection to a residential below-grade structure of this type. It was unusual, but it met every code requirement. I did not submit an application to the HOA Architectural Committee. I was not required to. The HOA guidelines did not cover underground structures, and the city permit was the relevant authorization. I did send a letter to Russell Beaumont as a courtesy, informing him that I would be beginning construction on a permitted residential improvement project on my property, that the work would involve excavation and would be visible from the street during the construction phase, and that I had all required permits. I did not describe what I was building. I was not required to. Russell sent me a letter 4 days later asking for details about the project, and noting that any exterior modification to my property was subject to architectural committee review. I had Maureen, my attorney. Yes, I also have Maureen. Maureen is a real estate attorney in Louisville who apparently has a significant practice in HOA-related matters and whose Friday afternoons I have contributed to significantly over the years. Respond with a letter explaining that the project involved no exterior modifications as defined in the community guidelines, that the project was fully permitted by the relevant municipal authority, and that we were not seeking or required to seek committee review. The letter attached the relevant sections of the community guidelines and the city permit. Russell sent back a letter saying this was not how things worked in Pinecrest Ridge. Maureen sent back a letter saying that with respect, the community guidelines were how things worked in Pinecrest Ridge, and that Mr. Beaumont's opinion about how things should work was not the same as the rules. Construction began on a Monday in June. The excavation alone took 11 days. I had hired a contractor named Leo Stavros who specialized in below-grade residential and commercial construction and who had done several serious underground projects in the Louisville area. Leo was exactly the right contractor for this job, methodical, code-oriented, proud of his work, and deeply unbothered by neighborhood politics. I told him about the HOA situation, and he shrugged and said the only thing that mattered to him was the permit and the engineering, both of which were in order. The excavation was dramatic. I will not pretend otherwise. Digging a hole large enough to accommodate a 2,000 square foot below-grade structure with 8-foot ceilings requires moving a lot of earth, and moving a lot of earth involves large equipment and significant noise and a pile of excavated soil that temporarily dominates your backyard in a way that is visually arresting. Several neighbors stopped on the sidewalk to watch. Several of them came over to ask what was happening. I told them the truth. I was building a below-grade residential improvement. When they asked what specifically, I told them I was building a large underground space that I was going to finish as a combination storage area, workshop, and emergency preparedness facility. The emergency preparedness framing was accurate and also, I admit, chosen with some care. Because in Kentucky and in many parts of the country, taking emergency preparedness seriously is not unusual or eccentric. Severe weather, power outages, the general instability of supply chains, these are real concerns that reasonable people plan for. A below-grade structure that could function as a storm shelter and supply storage was a genuinely sensible thing to build. I was also personally interested in having a serious workshop space, which is what had started the whole shed business in the first place. But I also liked the framing because it was difficult to object to without sounding like you were against people being prepared for emergencies, and Russell Beaumont was going to need all the rhetorical footing he could find. Russell sent me a second letter during the excavation phase, then a third. He sent a violation notice claiming the excavation was an exterior modification. Maureen responded. He escalated to the full HOA board. I attended that board meeting with my permit, my engineer's drawings, the HOA guidelines with the relevant omission highlighted, and Maureen on the phone in my jacket pocket in case I needed her. I presented the documentation calmly and completely. The board, to its credit, looked at the community guidelines, looked at the city permit, looked at the highlighted absence of any underground provision, and voted 3-2 not to issue a formal violation. Russell and Carol were the two. The construction continued. It took 4 months from breaking ground to the point where the below-grade structure was weathertight, waterproofed, and ready for interior work. The concrete walls went in poured concrete, 12 inches thick, fully waterproofed on the exterior with a drainage mat and perforated pipe system that carried any groundwater away from the structure. The ceiling was a reinforced concrete slab with engineered penetrations for the ventilation system and the electrical conduit and the 2 access points. The access points were worth describing. The primary access was a staircase from inside my house. I had opened a section of my basement floor to connect the existing basement to the new below-grade level, creating a seamless internal connection so you could walk from my kitchen down to my basement and continue down another flight into the new space without ever going outside. The secondary access was an exterior hatch in the backyard, a steel cellar door set flush with the grade, which served as the emergency egress and also the entry point for large equipment and supplies during installation. Neither of these was visible from the street. The backyard hatch was screened by the house from the road. The interior staircase was inside the house. From the street, when construction was complete and the landscaping was restored, you could not tell anything was there. The yard looked like a yard, better than before, actually, because Leo's crew had graded and seeded the disturbed areas, and the result was a cleaner lawn surface than I had started with. Russell drove slowly past my house twice on the day the landscaping was finished. I watched him from the front window. He stopped once and looked at the yard. There was nothing to see. He drove on. The interior finishing took another 3 months. I did much of that work myself on weekends, which was the most satisfying part of the entire project. Sandra helped with the design decisions. We finished one large room as the main storage and workshop space, proper workbenches, pegboard tool storage, shelving along the full perimeter, a small woodworking area with dust collection. We finished a second room as what we were calling the preparedness suite, which contained a serious supply storage system, a backup power setup with battery storage and a generator connection, and a small communications setup. We finished a third space as a general-purpose room that could serve as a storm shelter, a guest overflow space, or whatever we decided we needed it to be over the years. The ventilation system Derek had designed was excellent, positive pressure, fresh air supply with filtered intake, ensuring the space never felt closed or stale. The lighting was LED throughout, bright and even, with backup lighting on the battery system. The floors were sealed concrete, comfortable and easy to clean. The walls were painted a warm off-white that made the space feel open despite being below grade. When it was done, I stood in the main room and looked at 2,000 square feet of finished below-grade space that I owned outright, that was fully permitted, that no HOA committee had any authority over, and that was the direct consequence of Russell Beaumont denying me a 12 by 16 garden shed. I invited Phil and Derek and Leo for a walkthrough. Phil walked the perimeter and checked the drainage and said it was as good as anything he had worked on. Derek ran through the ventilation system and said the air quality readings were excellent. Leo stood in the main room and said, with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman looking at finished work, that it was a good structure and it would stand a long time. Sandra came down with 2 glasses of bourbon, which she handed to me and then held up her own. "To Russell Beaumont," she said. "To Russell Beaumont," I said, "the man who made all of this necessary." We drank. The story of what happened next in the neighborhood is in some ways less dramatic than the story of building the bunker, but it is in other ways more satisfying, because it unfolded slowly and completely in the way that things unfold when the initial action has been large enough and clear enough that the consequences are inevitable. Russell found out what was below my yard about 6 weeks after construction finished. I had not been secret about it. I had been straightforward with every neighbor who asked, and the neighborhood talked, as neighborhoods do. What I had not done was make an announcement or send Russell a tour invitation. He found out through the network of Pinecrest Ridge gossip the same way everyone else did, which was that enough people had asked me what I was building, and I had told them, and the information had traveled. He came to my door on a Sunday afternoon. I answered it. He was wearing a polo shirt and khakis, and the expression of a man who has decided he is going to be controlled about something that is making him very uncontrolled inside. "Tom," he said, "I understand you've completed your project." "That's right," I said. "I'd like to understand what you've built." "A below-grade residential improvement," I said, "fully permitted. We went through this." "I understand what the permits say," he said. "I want to understand the scope." I looked at him for a moment. He had denied my shed. He had sent me violation notices during construction. He had tried twice to get the board to stop the project. He had lost every time. Now he was standing on my porch wanting to understand the scope. "It's 2,000 square feet of finished below-grade space," I said. "Workshop, storage, emergency preparedness, reinforced concrete walls and ceiling, full mechanical ventilation, backup power. The structural engineering is available on file with Louisville Metro if you want the technical details." Russell was quiet for a moment. I watched him processing this. 2,000 square feet, he said. "Correct. You built a 2,000 square foot bunker because I denied your shed." He said it flatly, not as a question. He had understood the math. "I built a 2,000 square foot below-grade residential improvement," I said pleasantly, "because I needed storage space and workshop space, and the permitted options above grade were restricted. The below-grade option was not restricted, so I used it." He looked at me for a long moment. "You understand that this sets a precedent," he said. "It does," I said. "It establishes that residents in Pinecrest Ridge who cannot get above-grade permits approved can use below-grade construction as an alternative, provided they meet city code. It's a useful precedent. I imagine several neighbors will find it interesting." Russell left without saying anything further. I went back inside and told Sandra he had come. She said, "How did he look?" I said he looked like a man who had just done the math on something and did not like the answer. She said that sounded about right. Over the next several months, the precedent I had described to Russell became a real and active thing. 3 other Pinecrest Ridge homeowners came to me separately to ask about my project, not because they wanted underground bunkers, because they had had permits denied by Russell's committee for various above-grade projects, and they wanted to understand the below-grade option. I explained it each time honestly and completely: the process, the costs, the requirements, the fact that the guidelines were silent on underground structures. I told each of them to consult with their own attorneys and engineers. I shared the permit documents and the engineering approach at a level of generality that was helpful without being free professional services. 2 of them hired Phil to do geotechnical assessments of their lots. 1 lot was not suitable. The water table was too high on that side of the ridge. The other was suitable. That homeowner, a man named Curtis Webb, who had been trying for 2 years to get a workshop addition permitted and had been denied 3 times, began planning his own below-grade project. Curtis's project was smaller than mine, 800 square feet, designed as a finished workshop, but it moved faster because he had my experience to learn from, Phil's existing familiarity with the neighborhood's soil conditions, and Leo, who I had introduced him to and who gave him a favorable rate because he liked the work and liked the client. Curtis broke ground 4 months after my project finished. Russell sent him violation notices. Curtis, who had learned from watching my situation, had Maureen's contact information already and responded to each notice correctly and promptly. The board voted on his project the same way they had voted on mine. Russell was 2-2 against every time, and ties meant no action. But it was not the second project that changed things. It was the meeting. 6 months after my project completed, someone, I genuinely do not know who initiated it, but I have my suspicions about Gwen, who had been watching the whole sequence with great interest from 2 doors down, organized an informal neighborhood gathering at the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening. About 40 households came. I came. Sandra came. Curtis came. Russell came, which surprised me, though on reflection it should not have. Russell was not the kind of person who stayed away from things where decisions might be made. The gathering was not an official HOA meeting, and it had no formal agenda. It was simply neighbors talking about the neighborhood. But neighborhoods have a way of using informal gatherings to say things they have not said officially, and this one was no exception. Over the course of 2 hours, several residents described projects they had wanted to do that had been denied or delayed by the committee, patterns they had noticed in the denials, and feelings about how the approval process was working. Nobody was shouting, nobody was making accusations. People were just talking, neighbor to neighbor, about what their experience had been. Russell spoke several times during the evening. He defended the committee's record. He talked about community character and visual standards and the importance of maintaining property values. He was not unreasonable in tone. He genuinely believed what he was saying. But the room had heard from 15 families by the time he spoke, and the cumulative picture those 15 families had drawn was not a picture of a committee protecting community character. It was a picture of one man's preferences being applied inconsistently to his neighbor's properties, while his own property operated under different standards. 3 people in the room had brought photos, their own projects denied. Compared to similar or larger projects Russell had approved or that existed on his own property without apparent review. Near the end of the evening, someone asked me directly, "Tom, do you regret building the bunker? Would you do it differently if you could go back?" I thought about it honestly before answering. I thought about the shed I had wanted. I thought about the 4 months of construction and the cost and the complexity and the drawn-out fight with Russell through every phase. I thought about the 2,000 square feet of finished space below my yard, the workshop I spent my Saturday mornings in now, the supply storage that had gotten us through a 3-day power outage last February without any real disruption. No, I said, I would not do it differently. The shed would have been simpler and cheaper, but the shed would have been a storage structure. What I built instead was something I use every week and will use for the rest of the time I live in this house. Russell's denial forced me to think bigger than I would have thought on my own, and what came out of that thinking was genuinely better than what I had started with. If anything, I should thank him. The room laughed. Russell did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth did something complicated. The following month, an item appeared on the official HOA board agenda calling for a review of the Architectural Committee's composition and procedures. It had been submitted by 4 board members, 3 of the 5, which was a majority without Russell or Carol's support. The item proposed expanding the committee to 5 members, with 3 elected at large by the full membership rather than appointed by the board, and requiring written reasons for all denials with an automatic appeal right to the full board. The proposed changes passed at the next annual meeting by a wide margin. Russell remained on the committee as one of the 2 board-appointed members, but his 3 colleagues on the expanded committee were elected by the neighborhood, a retired architect named Howard Park, a landscape designer named Terry Meadows, and Curtis Webb, whose below-grade workshop was by that point fully framed and on track to be finished by fall. The first meeting of the new 5-member committee reviewed 14 pending applications. 12 were approved. 1 was deferred for additional information about drainage. 1 was denied on clear and specific grounds relating to a genuine setback violation. Russell voted no on 9 of the 12 approvals. He was outvoted 9 times. My shed permit application, the original one, 12 by 16 feet, 192 square feet, fully within the guidelines, was resubmitted by Sandra as an experiment, with no changes from the original submission. It was approved unanimously by the new committee, including a yes vote from Carol Nguyen, who had apparently been waiting for a committee where her vote was not predetermined. I built the shed. Tommy from 2 stories over came out and did it in a day, because a 12 by 16 garden shed takes a day when there are no obstacles. It sits at the back corner of my yard next to the oak tree, cedar siding, a pitched roof, clean lines, exactly where I had planned it 3 years earlier. Inside it, I keep my lawn equipment, my camping gear, my garden tools, and approximately 30% of the items that used to be in my garage. Sandra parked both cars in the garage for the first time the evening after the shed went in. She stood in the garage, looking at the 2 cars side by side, with the expression of someone who had been told for 3 years that what she was looking at was not possible. "The shed," she said. "The shed," I said. We built a 2,000-square-foot bunker, and it ended in a 12 by 16 shed. "It's a good shed," I said. She shook her head slowly. Then she started laughing. The real kind of laughing, the kind that has some relief in it, that comes when something long and difficult is finally simply over. I laughed with her. We stood in the garage between our 2 cars and laughed until it settled. The bunker is still there. Of course it is still there. It is reinforced concrete, and it is built into my property, and it cost more than my first car, and it is objectively the most structurally sound thing on my lot. On Saturday mornings, I take my coffee downstairs and spend a few hours at the workbench doing whatever project I am in the middle of. Sandra comes down sometimes and reads in the comfortable chair in the corner of the preparedness room, because it is quiet and climate-controlled, and she says it is the most peaceful room in the house. Last February, when we lost power for 72 hours in an ice storm, we ran the house off the battery backup, kept warm, kept the refrigerator cold, and watched a movie on the laptop while our neighbors were driving to hotels. Reggie from down the street came over on the second day to ask if we had power. I told him to come in out of the cold. What Russell Beaumont wanted was a neighborhood that looked the way it had always looked and changed only when he permitted it to change, and existed according to his sense of what was right and appropriate. What he got instead was a neighborhood that had woken up to the difference between rules and preferences, that had restructured its governance to make that difference enforceable, and that now had at least 2 significant below-grade structures sitting beneath its carefully maintained lawns, doing exactly what their owners needed them to do, visible to no one, unregulated by any guideline, permitted by the city, and permanent. Plus 1 12 by 16 cedar shed at the back corner of my yard that I use every single week, and that looks completely, perfectly ordinary. Which was all I ever wanted. Thumbnail text. HOA said no to a shed. I built a bunker instead. DNIED MY shed permit. Built 2,000 SQFT underground. RUSSELL said no. I went underground and won.